All right, I am going to be showing off the more specialty tools that are needed for rebuilding a diff. So I'm not going to cover just the random sockets you need and the like, but here's the more unusual tools that you might not have lying around. You're going to need at least 2 torque wrenches. One of them is going to have to be a very low range 1/4 inch drive torque wrench because you're going to be working with very, very low torque specs. Then you're going to want a 3/8 inch drive for its slightly higher range. You're going to need a bar type 1/4 inch drive torque wrench to measure the rolling resistance of the bearings. And then the other really odd tool you're going to need is a dial indicator. You're going to need to either modify or find a specialty 30 millimeter socket to deal with the pinion nut. You're going to need a set of shims, and then a breaker bar, marking compound, some various Allen drives, and a good set of calipers or micrometer. So I'm going to show you how to remove the output shafts. These are not held in with any bolts. They're just held in with a little circlip. So you want to get a prying tool of any kind, screwdriver, crowbar, any of these work, and you want to press on the actual flange, not on its little protector plate in there, and just give it a good little tug, and that's all it will take. It will pop right out. The circlip is going into this groove, and it's buried in there, and that's how you pull them out to put them back in. You push it in lightly, and you will feel when it gets close that it's rubbing on the splines, and you want to turn it until it lines up with the splines, and it will click in, and it's that simple. Okay, so here I'm going to go over how to set up a dial indicator to actually measure the backlash. So you have a dial indicator, a magnetic mount would be hugely helpful. Anywhere on the outside of the case is fine. You want it against a tooth, specifically the running side of the tooth rather than the coasting side. And you're going to turn the output in a direction to push the tooth towards the dial indicator until it's zeroed out. And your dial indicator may vary from mine, but you're going to work on getting it so that it's at the 0, and then you are going to take the carrier and you're going to turn it in the opposite direction, and it will click. And based on this dial indicator measurement, I am at about 0.0026 inches, so 2.6 thousandths of an inch. Spec for these is from 0.0024 to 0.0055 from BMW, and Metric Mechanic is tighter within that of 0.003 to 0.0035. So this is in spec, although it's pretty tight, but that's okay. You can repeat this measurement a couple of times to make sure it's accurate and write it down, but it's just all about measuring right there. It's a very small movement, and it's that simple. All right, so you've pulled out your diff, and you're ready to rebuild it. You take off the rear cover, that's easy. What do you need to do before you start taking it apart? The first and most important thing is you're gonna use a dial indicator to get your initial lash measurements, and you're gonna put some gear marking compound on it, and you are going to take photos of what the engagement pattern looked like. So you can get this gear marking compound on Amazon. It's kind of this tacky stuff, and you can wipe it on over top of the oil on the teeth. And you want to get a couple of teeth covered in this in 3 to 4 sections along the gear set. So you don't just want to do one spot. You want to get one area and then come around, do a different part of the ring gear and do another section. That way you're getting a more you're getting a more accurate idea of what's going on across the entire gear. And this stuff is designed to work in diff, so it's not gonna, yes, this is contamination in the oil, but like it's fine. It's designed to be here, so it's not gonna hurt anything. But it's a very pasty marking compound so that you can really see where the 2 teeth are contacting each other. So this allows us to, without having to put a window into the side of the case, we can see how the pinion and the ring are interacting with each other. So if I kind of hold the carrier and make it a little harder for it to turn, I can apply resistance and do a couple of revolutions this way and then do a couple of revolutions the other way, and we will be able to see on the ring gear the actual contact pattern. Yeah, here you can see it. So this is a little sharp and it's a little bit out towards the heel rather than the toe, but this is a known good diff. So our end goal with the new rebuilt diff is to match this pattern as closely as possible or get it even better than this. All right, so now I have the dial indicator hooked up. You're trying to measure the actual tooth, and once you get it set to a 0, you're just gonna rock the carrier back and forth, and this is telling you the amount of lash between the ring gear and the pinion. Now this one comes out to about 3.5 thou, which is in spec for BMW. I will have links in the description with the actual specifications from both Metric Mechanic and BMW for what is acceptable lash. But it's very important to have this measurement before you take it apart so you know what you're trying to get back to. So next step is taking off the outputs. These guys are not actually bolted in. They're simply held in by a circlip. So you just take a pry bar and they pop right out. They can be a little stiff or they can not be, but these guys are really, really easy to take out. Left and right on every diff I've seen doesn't matter, but we very quickly will be getting into stuff that is left and right specific. All right, so next step is once all those bolts are off, you have to take off the output flanges. So BMW left you this nice little tab at the top, and you take a big old chisel and you're trying to rotate it. On both of them, you're trying to get it to rotate out. And this is the part where they just pop out. Now this shim is very important to keep on its side. We're gonna measure these. If you're doing anything more inside the diff than just changing out the clutch plates, you will need to change out those shims. So BMW sells a shim kit and you will need that, which means you need to know which size shim was on which side. But once those are off, the carrier comes right out and you can set it down. Be very gentle so you don't damage the cage, because you can get it, if you set it down too hard, the cage will pop off and then you've got a whole bunch of roller bearings everywhere and it's not fun. But yeah, that's how you take the carrier out of a 188mm diff. You can see the pinion in here. It should turn nice and easy. This one actually has a little bit of resistance to it, so I suspect that when we pull apart those bearings, we're going to find that there's a little bit of damage on those pinion bearings. All right, so after you have cataloged measurements of which shim is left and right and what their thicknesses are, those can be set aside. Take your carrier and put it in the press. Now, if you don't have a some sort of a press between, or sorry, a cup between the bearing race, this cage, and the bottom surface, it's going to destroy the cage. Since we're replacing these bearings, we don't care, but when we're putting the new ones on, we're going to actually use the old races to support it so we don't do what just happened here where we just crush that cage. So when this comes back out, those rollers are going to fall everywhere. But so you put it in the press and you compress it so that it holds it stationary, and now you're going to break loose these screws. These are for the LSD carrier, and these are what is holding in the actual LSD clutches. So you would do all of this work if you were just doing a clutch rebuild on your clutch type limited slip. And also, you don't need a fancy press. This is just a Harbor Freight press. It'll work fine. But you break all these loose, and then we'll take them out, and we will show you how all the stuff inside works. Okay, so now all those bolts are out. And as I release this plate is going to separate from the actual carrier, just like that. But it's still in there pretty stiff, so I'm going to take this off, and there we go. Called it. So now I'm just going to walk this up. Sometimes they come out really easy. Sometimes they require a lot of encouragement, but this is the part where you definitely want to start taking lots and lots of photos of the order that all of these shims come off. So there's one shim right here that might come out with this magnet. Can I get a flathead screwdriver instead? Small, like mini pry tool sized. There we go. Oh, never mind. All right, so we have this shim. Then we have this spring washer. And note that the higher point on the inside is facing out. So it doesn't go like this. It goes with the high point facing out. So that's the next shim. Then we have this little oil shim. Thank you. These guys sometimes wear some clutch kits come with new ones of these, but they tend to be okay. Just note that the textured surface was down. Then we have one of the main springs. Again, the inner ring is the higher point and it's facing out. So this is what is compressing the clutch plates. The little spring there was compressing the actual spider gears. And now we have one of the wear plates for the clutch. This guy is something that you would replace typically when you get a replacement set of clutches. They can be a little bit sticky when they're covered in oil, but so they're typically not directional, but it's a plate that is always rotating with the carrier, and below it here is one of the clutches, and this is mounted to the spiders, and I'll show kind of how this is working here in a moment. But here is one of the clutches. This one's relatively worn. It does have grooves in it, so it still had more life. It's not uncommon to see some serious damage to this surface, and especially to these guys, where you may have like embedded material from the clutch that's been gouged in. They can be torn up. It's not the end of the world if you see that, but this one happens to be in really, really good shape. So now we have one of the spider gear support components. Again, I have not found these to be picky about being directional, but when you get modified bearing ramps diff ramps for changing how it locks up under acceleration or deceleration, they are modifying these grooves to be a different shape. So let me show you how that works. Here we have the actual spider gears. Here is one of the main gears, and we'll pop out the spider gear assembly here. There are little pins on these guys usually. These ones may not have the pins. Typically, I have seen little pins that stick up out of this. The fact that this one doesn't have them tells me probably doesn't matter. But anyways, I promise I know what I'm doing. So, I'm going to pop out the other side here really quick and show how this mechanism actually functions. We're going to get some clutch plates that I'm just going to slap back in there for the moment. Slide this out of the way. So you have the spider gears in here all held together in this assembly. Each of these outputs is spinning with the wheels. This carrier is locked, or this like housing is locked into the carrier. So this is always spinning at one speed, but when you have one wheel that's trying to spin on its own, it's going to try and force this housing to separate. It's going to try and move it out using those ramps. And the moment it presses out, it's applying more normal force to the clutches, and they resist that movement. So as this tries to rotate out, it tries to press on the bearings, and that's going to happen anytime you have wheels that are moving at different speeds. It's without the preload on it, I can easily do this, but when installed, it's extremely difficult to do this. And that's going to force these apart and cause it to start to lock up. By changing the angle of these surfaces, you can change how much mechanical advantage it has to force this plate out under acceleration versus deceleration, and if it's linear or non-linear. But out of the box, they're 45-degree on both acceleration and deceleration. And with the stock number of clutches, that translates to about 25% lockup. But so after we get all that apart, then in the bottom of here we have another clutch and another spacer doodad plate. Some of the aftermarket ones of these are like cross-drilled for better oiling, whatever, your mileage may vary. Then we have another spring with this time with the higher surface being the inside facing down. And then we have a spacer plate, if I can get it to pop out, that is only on this side, and it's due to the shape of the carrier. If you will, there we go. So this spacer plate, it usually has very nice witness marks that help you figure out what's going on. You can also see the witness mark on the inner edge here that's indicating that the raised surface of this was contacting there rather than like this. But then finally we have another of these oil rings with, again, the textured surface facing towards the spider gears. Then another spring with the higher inner ring facing away from the spider gears. And lastly, another spacer plate that's non-directional. That is everything inside the carrier. When you get a rebuild kit, it's usually going to include just sets of these. Some of the more complete kits also will include new oil rings. I'll leave that up to your discretion about whether you want to get them. And then some companies also make drop-in ramps that are modified, or you can have these planed down so you can fit more clutches for more lockup. There's a lot of ways to play with this, but this is fundamentally how it's working. Now I'm just going to clean all this and we'll start putting it back together with new parts. So here we have one of the output housing flange doodads. So I've already pressed out the, just with a hammer and a block of wood, the old seals and the O-ring. I ran these through the ultrasonic, but these don't need to be cleaned to do this. So there's still the outer race of one of the carrier bearings here. And I'm going to show you how to remove these without a hydraulic press and very specific tools for pressing out this race. Because you would need essentially a custom machined piece of steel to correctly press this out. So I'm just going to set it in the vise on, making sure not to clamp it, but just resting on these surfaces. And then I'm pressing, if you want to get the camera in there, I'm very specifically pressing on the actual race. Right there, it's exposed just a little bit. And I'm just going to work the two sides, ow, back and forth with a couple of hammer taps. Boom, there it's out. Now you definitely want to hang on to your old races, because during reassembly, we're actually going to use these to press the new races in. These are going to be our cups for the hydraulic press. So don't throw these out. So this is one end of the carrier. There is a inner race on each end of the carrier, and there are two holes that can be used to access the bearing from the backside if you have a proper puller or a punch and a hammer and a lot of time. You can actually press this bearing off. However, there's a different way that you can deal with bearings. Bearing races are made of extremely hard steel, and so what you can do is you can use some sort of a cutter like a Dremel and put a deep cut into the bearing, and then using a good chisel, if you put it into the cut and hammer on it, you can cause the bearing to split where you have made that cut, and then it will come off by hand extremely easily. I want to stress this is not the only way, this is not necessarily the best way, but it is a fast and accessible way as long as you are good with your hands and don't cut into the source material. You don't need to even cut all the way through the bearing. You just need to get a deep notch in it, and then it will crack along that. So I am going to set this into the vise, hold it down. I'm not gonna go crazy because I don't wanna mar the surface in there. And then I'm just gonna go to town with the Dremel and make a nice good slot into this. Please wear eye and ear protection. So you're making a nice deep groove into the bearing, and you put your chisel in it, and that was enough. That bearing just split, you can see it right there, and now I can pop it right on it. Makes that real easy. All right, so we finished disassembly of the carrier. You have either cleaned that or not, but the last part of disassembly is to remove the pinion from the case, because there are bearings and seals in there that we need to get out. So, on the input nut, there is this lock ring, and you're going to find a creative method of, you're never gonna recover this, expect to destroy it, you have to have a new one, but you're gonna get this crush ring out. Now, because we're rebuilding this diff, I don't care about the markings of this nut. I'm not going to mark it, because none of that's gonna matter. If you're just changing this input flange, you probably want to mark that, but I'm going to cover that more in detail later about best practices for changing input flanges. Anyways, creatively find a way to remove this and then just bang the nut off with an impact, and we will do next steps on the press. So I forgot to mention this. So after creative removal of the lock ring that's going around that, you're gonna need a 30mm socket, but the clearance between the nut and the flange is quite tight. So you're gonna need specialty tool. I don't know what the number is, so I'm gonna call it 123, but you can go to the store and just buy a 30mm socket, put it on the grinder. I painted it just so it wouldn't rust in my garage. But yeah, there should never be an insane amount of torque on these, so this will work fine, but yeah. You're gonna need a special 30mm. All right, so now that this guy is broken loose, I just used an impact with that fancy 30mm socket. That comes off. This guy will slide right off. This one, interestingly, that's indexed, but the pinion isn't. Whatever. But so now, very important, you really don't want to damage these threads, so you're gonna put the nut back on. We will be reusing the nut. And now you need to press the entire pinion out of the case. So you're gonna take this whole doodad and you're gonna put it in your Harbor Freight press. And you're gonna make sure that the nut is what is touching the press and not the top of that pinion. And you're gonna get it loaded up. And I would highly recommend having a hand below to catch the pinion so that it doesn't drop out. There we go. Alrighty. I'm gonna move this back over to the table. Take the nut off. And here is the pinion. This is the crush washer for bearing preload. You're gonna wanna hang on to this and measure it. We're gonna need it later. But so for now, just slap the nut back on and that'll prevent this guy from getting lost. But here's the pinion. This is the rearward bearing set, and the front bearing still actually in there, up at the front. And we're just gonna press all these out, rip out the O-rings, And yeah. So, last part is removing the two outer races that are in the actual case here. You can see this upper one, and there's another one down here. But the fun part is in between this lower race and the case is the pinion shim. So the method that I use, because I don't have a fancy set of cups for my hydraulic press, is I just use a big old chisel and a hammer. But it's really important when you're pressing on this lower one that you don't, here, I'll move it over to here. You really, really don't want to press on that shim. Right now it's not visible, but as this race goes down, it's very easy to accidentally hammer on the shim. You really don't want to do that. So keep an eye on it. Make sure that you're always pushing the shim out of the way. I'll show here in a little bit, once I've got it like halfway down, what I'm really talking about there. But same method as before that I used on the outer races in the output flanges. You're just going to hammer them on either side and walk them out. So now that I've got this descended a little bit, you can see in here, this piece of metal that I can move around, that is the shim. It's very easy to accidentally put the chisel on that. You really don't want to. You want to make sure that it's still on the actual bearing race. But that is the pinion shim. We need to preserve that. So just keep hammering. It won't take long. Alright, so reassembly, this is the only part of the differential where you'll want to use assembly lube during the assembly process. For the rest of the differential, you explicitly don't, because you need to measure rolling resistances. But for this part, you can use assembly lube, it's good. So, this is the reverse of removal. So first things first is the flat shim. Orientation doesn't really matter on it. Then the wave washer with the high side, the high inside edge facing out. That goes in. Then the oil ring with the rough surface facing up. Towards the inside of the assembly, it has a little slot that it fits into. I'm going to put a little bit of this oil. It's super tacky, which is why it's assembly lube. You can't really go wrong with using too much of this, but whatever. It gets everywhere though. Okay, now the shim plate, which we're gonna monitor the wear marks on this and put it in the same orientation, but it doesn't really matter. This is not directional. You can put it in either way. All right, now the first big spring washer, the high inside edge faces out. And now we have the first, it's a big dab, but whatever. So now we put in the clutch friction, like the plate it's rubbing against. This guy goes in. And then this is not enough grease, but whatever. It's all gonna get covered in grease later. I know what I'm talking about, shut up. So this guy slots in. Now you put in, and you can just drop it in there. And now you put in the first carrier piece. So now you have the, I'll demonstrate with the other side. You have, in this order, you have the clutch disc rubs against this surface and this surface. And so it's sandwiched like that, but down in there. And now, this is the part where you engage this spline with the spline that was on the clutch. Slot this guy down in there, and it may be pretty tricky to get in, but it should work. Just spin it to make sure that you can. And now, we're going to do some light oil where I know I have bearing surfaces and on the teeth, and you just drop in the spider gears. Some of these have markings for, some of these have little pins that stick out like on this surface, but this one doesn't. So since it's not giving me ample information to like put these gears on the same... Okay, sometimes gear teeth are actually timed so that like one of these teeth always interacts with the same tooth on the pinion every time, and they're like super specific. So you want to get them rematched. These don't appear to be that way, but some of the earlier E34 diffs appear that they might have. It's whatever. I'm sure somebody's going crazy in the comments right now. I don't know what I'm doing. Why are you watching a YouTube video? So anyways, we slap in this guy next. Just a little bit more oil on there. I can work that around just to make sure that the teeth are happy. And then same as before, the carrier bit of boot. I don't know the technical terms. So a little bit of oil on that. Slide this guy in. And now it probably won't turn much, which we expect. A little bit more assembly lube on that. Friction plate. I can look at that wear mark and tell this guy goes facing outward. And then, this is the kind of fun part. So, in here, by kind of fun, I mean, not really. The super tacky oil is actually going to help us here. So, shim ring down. The high side of the spring washer goes down, although all these orientations are backwards because in reality we're dropping this down from the top. But anyways, then oil ring with the rough side facing up in this orientation, and now with a little bit of this tacky stuff, it should hold it together long enough that I can slap it on here, and it will definitely not seat all the way down because there are all those springs in there that are going to hold it tight. So it's only going to sit down this far, and that's expected. Now going to cover up this mess. And next thing we're going to do is press it on the, we're going to use the press to press this down and put in all our screws. So we've got it on the press. We're going to lock the press out. We're just going to come down by hand. The orientation of this block is reversible. You can get it off by 180 degrees and you won't hurt a soul. I'm using Loctite 243, which is the kind of mild, normal kind. And I'm just gonna thread two of these guys in by hand. They get tightened to 25 foot-pounds, according to Metric Mechanic and BMW. Okay, so we've got them all in and just snugged up, and the press makes this really easy to hold stationary. So torque wrench set to 25 foot-pounds, and we're just going to tighten all these down, and if it starts to spin on you, you just clamp it down. So there's one. And I'm going in a little bit of a like circular pattern. It's not really necessary because we brought them all down to snug first, but it doesn't hurt anything. These are very shallow Allens, so you really want to make sure that the socket is fully seated into the Allen. And it's very handy to, if there's any debris in there, you definitely want to get it out because then the socket won't get all the way seated. I think I've already done this one. And if you plan on popping the diff back open after assembly for inspection, it might be a smart idea to paint marker these just to make sure that they're not backing off. Okay, so I've got the new carrier bearings out. I've got the carrier flanges, the original shims, and the new hardware, although you can totally not, you don't have to get new hardware. And I pulled out my old races You'll see shortly why we have to keep those. And specialty tool number 433. Totally didn't make this myself. Actually, I totally did. This will become important later, but you need a bar type torque wrench that has a scale of inch-pounds. We're gonna go over the specs here shortly, but the first step of this process is we need to install the new bearings into this, and the pinion is not in yet. We are putting in the carrier first and getting the carrier's preload correct. Then we pull it all back out, and then we're gonna do the pinion and get its preload correct, and then we're gonna put it all together. So, we're gonna start with assembling bearings. We can take the old output flanges and grab the new race. Okay, so I have the first of the carrier flanges here. I have the new outer race, and there's a light bit of oil on all of this. And I need to press this new race in, and I'm going to start it with just this block. Set it in here. This allows me to gauge if I'm level or not pretty easy. And it's super important to start these by hand. Like, don't have the big tool on there, because you know you want this guy to go in straight. But we're just gonna work this in nice and smooth, and with a press it really shouldn't take a ton of force. But we're gonna get it in until it's flush, but it actually goes in a little bit farther than that. So we pop it back open, and we're gonna use the old race and set it on top upside down, and now we can press on this. But we don't want to do that at the very beginning, just so that it's easier to get things aligned. But now, to get it that last little bit in, we can do this. And this is how we're going to use almost all of the old races, and this is why it's so important to keep them, is to use as your press kit for the new ones. You can see it pop down that last little bit. I'm gonna give it a little snug up, make sure it's in. That's good. And then release. And now we have one new race. Obviously be gentle with these. So same process on the other side, using the other new race. If you start to get them confused, it should be pretty easy. This is still a good race, but it's obvious to see which one is new and which one isn't. All the wear in here obviously indicates that this is used, so that's how you can do a sniff check on all of this as you're assembling it before you accidentally assemble it with an old race. Or you could like mark them or paint them or do something, but just so you don't mix them up. Okay, so now we're gonna press on the inner races and cages to the carrier. So I didn't mention this before, but I'll mention it here now. You never press a bearing through the actual bearings, be them rollers or balls. If I want to press this inner race on, you don't do it by putting an outer race on and just pressing the outer race, because you'll dent the surfaces and the bearing may work fine initially, but it's going to shorten the life. So what you do is you press by the race that you're actually trying to fit. So in this case, I need to fit this inner race down on here, so I need to press directly on that race. And this is where the old races this is where the old races come in handy, because I can pull this out and use this as my press kit, so I don't need some fancy cup. But I can now use this and press the new race assembly with its cage right on there. This one's definitely a lot stiffer, so this takes a little bit more force. But there. First one down. So to do the other side, as you saw during disassembly, if I just set this race on the bottom, when I press the top, it's gonna blow this cage, or well, it's gonna bend the cage down, and then the cage is gonna end up falling right on off. So to do this, I have to set it on that race. That way, it is not actually resting on the cages of the bearing, and it won't break it. So now I grab the next bearing and the next race, and yeah, that's not correctly sized. Okay, we had to reorganize to make room for the taller stack height, but same deal. But importantly, the bottom one is resting on the race, so it's not resting on the cage, and we're using the old inner race here as well, and just impact rated or steel things to use to press through. And we're gonna slap this on. And because we're actually resting on the inner race below as well, when we get this tightened down, this is gonna try and squeeze both of them, so it'll make us really sure that they're both seated on. All right. So this is fresh off the press. And it's very important that you don't actually set it down on these cages, because it will bend them up and they could fall apart. So I recommend, while you're doing this assembly, very gently, but you're going to set it down onto your flanges, just so that it's not resting on the cage. But, so, next step is, we have our case with no pinion in it, and we are going to assemble this and tighten it down to measure our carrier preload. So we pop the carrier in, and you will have to like kind of roll it in. It's gonna make you cringe, but it's just how the world works. So then we have noted down, these are our original shims. Expect to change them, you will need a shim kit, but this one I labeled as left. So I'm gonna slap it back in. I know that there are no seals in anything yet. There are no O-rings, because right now we are just assembling to check preload. This is not a final assembly at all. But you slot on one side. These are extremely precision fit, so I recommend. There it is, bound up. Oh man. I recommend you get them in via rotation, but slot the first one on, put in a screw, bolt, whatever, I can English. First side is on. We can tilt this up to make it slightly easier. But now, second shim, I've labeled this one as being right side. Slap that on. Fit this on. Nice and easy. Now that that's in, the torque spec for these guys is first off, you need all of them in. And during final assembly, we'll probably put Loctite on these. We will. But right now, because they're just going in for a test fit of preload, we don't want to do that. But the torque spec is 10 foot-pounds plus 40 degrees. So you get them all in. The reason why I prefer to buy new ones is because you're gonna, especially the first time you do this, you're gonna be taking this part on and off a bunch as you figure out your shim thickness. So anyways, right now we are about to check the total. So I've got a shim on each side. If I make the shims thinner, they are squeezing these plates closer in and creating more rolling resistance here. Right now, everything's loose, and you can see this will free spin for days. The correct specification for this is for the carrier preload, BMW says 11 to 23 inch pounds, and Metric Mechanic, who also has posted documentation for these specifications, has said they like 9 to 11. What I take that to mean is you want something on the low end of the 11 to 23, but anything within 11 to 23 is in specification as according to BMW. So you take your good old 13 and whiz all these down. I'd highly recommend a star pattern of some kind because these guys will bind, the flange will bind up immediately if it's not straight. It's an extremely precise fit into the case of the diff. Okay, have the torque wrench set for 10 foot-pounds and tightening these down in a star pattern. Doing the same on the other side, and then we simply add 40 degrees, so about 45. I like to do this part on the floor, and I just go here to about there. Now, if we bring this back up onto the table, now it definitely turns stiffer, and this is where our turning tool comes in handy. So this is just an output flange that I have taken a block of aluminum and bored 2 holes in it to use the standard axle bolts, and then put a bolt in the middle that's, you know, tied off so that it won't turn, and there's Loctite on it. But the whole point is to be able to use a bar type inch-pound torque wrench. So we slot this guy in, which is being slightly annoying. Come on, where is... I need a rubber mallet. I think it's just because it's the first time I put this one in. And try the other side. This is an E34 flange, and this is an E36 diff. So, it's going in fine. Also, I don't have the new circlips in the carrier yet, so there's no clip holding it in. You can just pull it right out. That's fine. We have new circlips. Anyways, now what I'm looking for is for this to be between 11 and 23 inch-pounds when rotating continuously. And right now, it's a whopping, it's kind of hard to read, but I'm seeing about 30. So what that tells us is the current shims are too thin. We need slightly thicker shims. This measurement is why you cannot have assembly lube on these bearings, because it will throw these numbers, or differential fluid. This part, just the little bit of oil that's on them during assembly is all that you want to have there, because it will completely throw your numbers off. This part is done dry. But now you pull this apart and we're going to pull out our shim kits, but there are 2 sets. One is the smaller range, the other is the larger range. You're mostly going to use the smaller range, but I would still probably recommend having the larger range on hand because, well, if you need it, you need it. We ended up taking out the original 1.48 millimeter shim and pulling out from the kit. The next closest size up was labeled on the bag as 1.51, but I highly recommend that you cross-check that with a pair of calipers. When we measured it, it was actually coming out at 1.55 to 1.54. So compared to the original shim, a 0.06 millimeter increase in thickness, and that made the difference between about 30 inch-pounds of rotation and what we're at now, which is somewhere between an 11 and 12 pounds, 11 and 12 inch-pounds of rolling resistance. It turns smooth as butter, even though there's no oil in there. And when measured on the gauge, it will be very hard to show this in the video, but with a nice, smooth, continuous movement, it's sitting just above 10 at about 11 or 12. It's very hard to show on camera, but I promise you that's what it's reading. So that's on the bottom end of the BMW specs, but very, very, very close to the metric mechanic specs, which is where I like to be. I like to be kind of around the lower end of the BMW specs, but that's all complete. This was making a terrible grinding sound earlier because the dust shield was contacting this because no circlip. So if I put this all the way in, you can see it makes the terrible noises. If I pull it out just a hair, it would actually be somewhere like that. No sound, nice smooth movement, just to clarify. But we have now figured out the correct total width, the added value of the two shims now, which is 1.68 on the left and 1.54 on the right. That is the total shim thickness needed to have the carrier at the correct preload. We will find out the exact shim thicknesses left and right when we're doing our backlash adjustment. But that is now, the values for the carrier have been, the total values have been figured out. Now we're gonna move on to the pinion. Okay, so now we have to press on the new innermost rearward race on the pinion. So having removed all the old ones, you take this and just slide it on down and pull your old cut race. I know you're gonna be terrified that like, oh, but it's gonna stick on. Because you cut it off, it won't. So you slide that guy on there, and then just pull out the upper half of a strut tower from a 1968 BMW 1600-2. That fits perfect. And then, you know, there's some steel. And just, you know, give her a little of this. Yeah, in case you were wondering, there really is BMW part marks on here. Made in West Germany. And then slide this off, and boom. One new bearing on the pinion. So, once that's on, the next step is going to be pressing the races into this. Alright, so here we have the case on the press. We're going to put our new outer race for the forward bearing of the pinion on here, and then we're going to use the old race and we're going to slide it on there and use it as our press kit. And just this block, I suspect I'll have to do something fancy once this bottoms out, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. First we're going to get it seated in, and we're looking to make sure that it comes down nice and square. It's still loose. And now this is most of what bearing installation is just figuring out what am I going to use to press on this. Oh, I know. I have some. Just, you know, that random block of aluminum that you have lying around. That's 3/8 inch thick. Alright, that feels like it's wrong. Yep, that's in. Alright. first outer race installed. Now we're going to put in the rearward outer race for the pinion. That shim that you pulled out on removal, this is the part where you use it. Seriously, don't forget this shim. Shim goes in first. And this shim, in theory, this shim should always stay with the pinion. There used to be a shim kit for these. It's NLA now, but you could totally have them made if you call up the right people. But hopefully you don't need an adjustment of this, because it's a real pain in the butt to, one, change it out, and two, to actually find a kit of spares. But so, that in first, then you drop in the new race, and then I'm going to make a small tower of high-strength steel here to use to get that started. This is a lot of what pressing bearings is. It's just, all right, how do I do this? Is that touching on the back corner? All right, now that I've got it started, I'm going to take out that big flat block before it starts contacting stuff, and I'm going to replace it with the old race and then the flat block. And all right, that definitely is now fully seated, and we can check that by, when you grab all this, you reach down underneath, and you shouldn't be able to move that shim in there anymore. It should be, you shouldn't be able to hear it moving either. But so that's now fully seated. The next part we're going to do is press on the forward inner race. And to do this, we have to assemble the pinion in the case. So we have the two outer races in there, and what we are going to do is, on the press, we are going to support the pinion on this stand, lower the case on top of this, remembering to put in our new crush sleeve, and then we're going to put the upper race on top of that, and then use the output flange to press down, and we can grab the case and kind of yank up on it until the play is gone, because these two bearings have moved close enough together and the crush sleeve has done its job of crushing. If you really want to, you can measure the old crush sleeve and crush the new one close to that, but this assembly method allows us to kind of do this without having to worry about that. But we press it down until there's no more play, and then we're going to do the actual bearing preload after that by measuring the rolling resistance, and we're going to do that with a big breaker bar. But this is how we're going to press all of this together. The flange will be coming back off, so you still have time to put in your, we're not going to put in the output shaft seal yet, especially because if we need to take it apart, we don't want to have to destroy that seal. So, here goes. So I'm just slotting this guy with the crush sleeve on it. Now if you could hand me the new bearing, please. Along with the new, the flange, the input flange. This. And then our plate of aluminum and the socket. Or just the plate of aluminum. Thank you. So the top bearing is going to be the one that's descending here. You can see it coming down. So right now, it still has quite a bit of slop. All right, so right now, we're really close because you can see, well, you can rather, if you come by the springs, you'll be able to hear it. There's still the tiniest bit of play there, but it's starting to behave more like the bearing it should be behaving like. But because we're crushing that crushed sleeve, it's pretty stiff. But right there, now there's no... So I want to take this moment to explain how to actually preload a bearing. Many of you have probably been taught that you just tighten it to a certain torque. That is not how you preload a bearing. Those are approximated torque specs that manufacturers have learned get you close. What you actually do to tighten a bearing is you go until it starts to bind. When you turn it, it feels gritty, and then you remove just a little bit of preload until that goes away. When you have a lot of preload but it turns smooth. BMW has given us rolling resistance specifications for where they think that it's best to have that turning force set at, where it's not binding yet, but it turns at a certain amount. So if you ever see any documentation that says, tighten this nut to this torque spec, this bearing set is too sensitive for you to do that. You really have to do this by rotational preload. So knowing that it's not quite done yet, I'm going to stop, because the last part we have to do using the nut and getting it to the correct setting. But now I can pull off the input flange, and you can hear that this has a little bit of vertical slop, and right now it'll have like 0 rolling resistance. But now we're gonna get set up. It's been pointed out to me that last section may not have been super clear. The input flange, this surface, when installed on here, either the nut that goes in here, the pinion nut, or what I just did with the pressing on this surface of the input flange, that load will be transferred right through to this surface, which is actually pressing on that inner race that I just put in. So the reason I supported the pinion rather than the case was so that I held the pinion in place and I was pressing this race onto the pinion. That's why the case could rotate, because if I were to support it by the case, it would just push the pinion. As I tried to push this race onto the pinion, it would just push it out. So that's why you saw me using this at the top, and why when it was in the press and tight, I could spin the whole case around, because it was actually supported on that input shaft, on the pinion. Okay, we're down on the floor now, because of course we are. The tools required for this part is, once again, we will need our torque wrench for measuring the rolling resistance, a 30mm socket, same one from the Disassembly, for tightening up the nut that's on the pinion, a big old pipe wrench, or some method of holding this stationary. So if you have a drive shaft that you can like weld a bar onto to hold, but because I always replace the little steel cover that protects the input shaft seal, I can just take off the old one, because this would beat it up, and then a nice breaker bar. So what we're going to do is we are going to hold the pinion stationary with the pipe wrench, and we are going to slowly tighten this up and then check the road. Yeah, that's still, you can even hear the bearing spinning. It still has slop in it. But we are going to do this until we have a torque, a rolling resistance of, according to BMW, 12 to 23 inch-pounds, and metric mechanic is 14 to 16. So if you're at 15 inch-pounds, you're inside both of them very nicely. But that's the target. And you're just tightening this guy up until you reach that. And once you reach it, if you want to put a stamping or like use a punch to mark it at that value, you certainly can. But it will be very stiff in doing this because you are still crushing that crush sleeve. Again, this would be why you might want to kind of pre-crush it, but I prefer not to because it can crush unevenly. It's kind of hard to get it to crush nice and smooth. And I'd recommend going in small increments because you don't want to overshoot. Because if you overshoot, then you need to replace that crush sleeve. And we're talking, at the end of a 24-inch breaker bar, we're talking maybe a 1/4 inch of movement being the difference between 10 and 20 inch-pounds. There we go, that's 15. Yeah, 16, but I'm gonna call that good. So now what we can do, just in case we need to pull this back apart, well, we don't have the input shaft seal here yet. We discovered we actually have the wrong one, but you can, we can do that right now. I'll do a Sharpie mark as well, but you can draw a line on both of them. And in theory, if you line up those two lines, then you're at the same spec. I'd still recommend checking it. This is, anytime you want to change the input flange, technically you need to pull the carrier out, clean all the oil off of that bearing, which you could do with brake clean, and you need to check the rolling resistance. With different flanges, you can't fully trust that if you just go to the same mark, it will be the same rolling resistance. But the other problem is you can't test the rolling resistance while it's covered in oil. We will recheck this number after like 1,000 miles on this diff, and untouched, if you pull the carrier out, you probably can't even read it on, you probably won't even get, I mean, I know on the 346 that I have over there, I rechecked it after I pulled it out, and I got like 1 or 2 inch-pounds on a diff that I know had 20 inch-pounds. And it's just what happens. Once it's had its break-in and it's covered in oil, 20 inch-pounds of resistance is, it drags. Okay, so now we have reapplied new gear marking compound to the, we applied new gear marking compound to the teeth. We have our two flanges here. We know with the combination of these two shims that the overall preload on this is correct. But now that the pinion's in there, the total height needs to stay the same, but we may have to change the thickness of either of them to move the carrier left and right so we get good engagement patterns and good backlash. But now, just like before, we go ahead and install the carrier, but now it's going to be a little bit trickier because there's a pinion in there. But it's still the same deal. And because I expect to take this off again as we measure this, I don't have, I don't have any of the O-rings or seals. We'll wait until it's all finalized to do that. So now, because there's a pinion in there, it's kind of holding up this side a little bit, which helps us out. Don't you bind up on me immediately. See, I feel like if you talk to inanimate objects, they will respond better. Yell at a diff enough and it might work. When trying to line up these holes, a great little tip is to grab a small screwdriver, and if you want to bring the camera in, I can press the screwdriver on this, and if you look through the bolt holes, I can move this around until I get a bolt hole to line up. And then I can just do a little of this with a little of that. But we get all this together, and we can start to look at, I would recommend just doing an initial, just snug them up and see if you're completely bound up on the pinion, or if it's worth actually trying out. Post-production Tom here to explain this image. So this image comes directly out of the Nissan S14 service manual, and this shows really, really well how to read the contact pattern, the engagement pattern that you're getting on those gear faces with the marking compound. This image is showing specifically how the engagement patterns tell you how you need to move the gears left and right. By the time you're looking at this, you should have already gotten your pinion and carrier preloads correct, at least once. And then this tells you, hey, does that carrier need to move left or right? So initially you'll use the backlash on the carrier, and once you get the backlash correct, you'll look at the engagement pattern. And if the engagement pattern looks like the bottom, you're good and you don't need to do any correction. But in all likelihood, it's because you've just changed all the bearings, it's not going to look like that. So you're going to need to move stuff around. Now, when you get your backlash set just right, you're probably going to see some component of either the top right or the top left. And what they are telling you is which way that pinion needs to move. So if you see the left, it's telling you that the pinion is too far forward. And even though you've got your backlash correct, the gears are not engaging in the right section. So the pinion needs to move towards the rear, and the carrier, because the pinion's moving rearward, the carrier is going to have to compensate by moving left. And you bring the pinion rearward, and then you readjust your carrier backlash to get it correct in terms of backlash with the pinion, and then recheck your engagement pattern. And if you see something like on the right, that's telling you that the carrier, your engagement depth is too deep. So the pinion needs to move towards the front of the car, and because it's moving forward, the carrier has to respond by moving right. And we figured out that this was about a 1-to-1 in metric. If you were to move the pinion 1/10 of a millimeter forward, it's about 1/10 of a millimeter to the right for the carrier. But that's just experimentally what I have found. But yeah, that's how, use this image to really learn how to read what these contact patterns are telling you. Here's the sniff check. Don't really feel any backlash. And let's get an initial look at that engagement pattern. It's currently not good. So the combination of the fact that this engagement pattern, if you look in, shows a contact point that's really deep in and it's really sharp, and the fact that I don't feel, there's a tiny little bit of backlash. I might I might proceed with this, but I expect this to be, once I get everything tightened down, I expect to see that the backlash is too tight. But we're gonna cut to it tightened down and a proper check. Okay, so we got everything bolted down and torqued to spec, and we just did a backlash measurement, and that combined with the wear pattern that I'm seeing on the teeth, or the engagement pattern that I'm seeing on the teeth, are telling me that the carrier is too far over the right. So while maintaining the overall thickness, we need to get a thinner shim on the left, a thicker shim on the left, and a thinner shim on the right to move the carrier this way. Now, how do I know I need to do that? One, I can't seem to actually measure the backlash. It's so small. I can feel that there's a tiny little bit on the pinion, but I can't seem to measure it. The diff definitely turns, but the other thing that's telling me that something ain't right is this engagement pattern. So, on the, how do I do this without getting all that sun? On the, I don't know where I put my flashlight, or whatever. On the coasting side of the tooth, you can see that it's extremely sharp, and it's more towards the outside of the tooth. That is telling you that the pinion's in pretty deep into this gear. And on the power side, the side that gets loaded when you're on throttle, it's, let me go to one that better shows it. There we go. It's pretty sharp and it's pretty down low, but this is borderline okay. It's low down, and so the coast side is pretty gnarly. This side's borderline, but that combined with the backlash measurement being so small that I can't read it, tells me that we need to move the carrier left. So this is where you pull out your calculator, you add up the thickness of the two shims, and now you look through your shim kit and you look for, okay, you know, I can go one size up on this and one size down on this, but you want to try and maintain the overall thickness as close as possible. And we're just going to cut to us with the next set of shims in, because I don't need to demonstrate how to pull this carrier apart again and change out those shims. So here the diff is reassembled with, we now have the original 1.48 millimeter shim on the right, and we have a 1.74, 1.75 millimeter shim on the left. So we are almost exactly the same 3.22 overall thickness, but with the carrier now moved 0.06 millimeters to the left. What that resulted in is now we have a measured backlash via the dial indicator of about 2.7 thou, which is within spec. So BMW spec is 2.4 to 5.5 thou, and metric mechanics within that is 3 to 3.5 thou. Thou being thousandths of an inch. Yes, I know we're using metric shims, but measuring backlash in imperial, I don't care. It was pointed out to me that I should explain fundamentally what is backlash. So when you design gears, you think of them as meshing together, but they don't. You have to leave a little bit of slop, and you have to leave it for a multitude of reasons. The biggest of which being, one, you have to leave room for the oil film. The oil takes up space, and so you need to leave room for it. If you made the gears always touching, there would be no room for the oil. And the other reason is thermal expansion. It might behave this way when cold, but when hot it could expand out, and so you need to leave margin. But the gear faces and the teeth are actually cut specifically accounting for having that little bit of slop. The way that the physical faces touch each other are depending on there being that little bit of slop. And it's really, really important to get it right, because if it's wrong, the teeth will end up trying to cut into each other rather than sliding against each other. So with the backlash wrong, you can expect this bad boy to maybe last you about 50 miles before it's just gonna lock up. The faces will get extremely hot. Well, if the backlash is too tight, the faces will get extremely hot and the diff will probably lock up on you. If it's too large, the faces will actually be able to pick up speed as they'll be slamming into each other, and it's quickly going to tear them apart, and you're gonna have short term you'll have very sparkly oil. Long term there will be chunks. But so it's really important to get backlash right. But if we come in and look at this engagement pattern, anyways, we can see that now we have on the coast side, yes, it's a little bit outboard, but it's much more open and oval shaped. It's still a little sharp, but we're gonna go back and look at the pictures of the original wear pattern. I suspect this is relatively close to what it looked like. And up here on the driving side, we've got a nice big, wide and smooth wear pattern. This is ideally you would want a nice little oval in the center of every tooth on both the coast and the driving side, but this ain't bad at all. And with that backlash being in spec and our rolling resistances for both the pinion and the carrier being in spec, this diff's ready to button up. And so at this point, we'll come back for seal installation, because we're gonna pull this back apart to install the seals, but they sent us the wrong pinion seal, so we gotta wait for the rest of them. But now you can put all the O-rings and circlips and all the final stuff on, and then bolt on your rear cover and give her a little bit of this. So we are currently in the process of reshimming the pinion. We put it in and we got decent marks for engagement pattern, and we were in spec on our preloads and all of our rolling resistance, but it wasn't quite right, and I really wanted to demonstrate something that was pretty bang on perfect for this. I still stand by that with its engagement pattern with the original shim, it would have been runnable. It would have been safe to run, but it might have had a slight whine to it. You know, I really wanted to get this one perfect. So we got a shim set. Unfortunately, they're NLA from BMW, so we bought them from where?
Ireland Engineering.
Oh, okay. And the original shim was 3.5 millimeters thick. Yeah, we're gonna start with an adjustment of it. It was at 3.5, and just for a first guess, we're gonna bring it down to 3 and readjust and see where that puts us. Now we also pulled out the clutches and soaked them in oil, so I am re-verifying my carrier preload, because while in theory it shouldn't change because the bearings are all the same, it may have changed. So I'm just gonna re-verify that while the pinion is out, and then once that's good, I won't have to recheck it because I'm not gonna pull the carrier apart again. But yeah, so that's next steps. We're putting in new pinion shim, and we're gonna, you know, same process as before. We have to get the preload and rolling resistance right on the pinion with the carrier out, and then put the carrier in and shim it left and right until backlash and engagement pattern look good. And if we can't get them right, then we'll pull it back out and readjust it. We need to move the pinion towards the front of the car, and then the carrier is going to move towards the passenger side to compensate for as the pinion moves forward to keep backlash correct. The carrier, because as it moves out due to this angle, it's also moving away, like in theory like this, from the carrier. So the carrier has to move towards the passenger side as the pinion comes out.
Good.
Okay, so we have the new shims in. We went from 3.5 to 3.1.
3.1.
3.1. All right, so 3.10. new, you know, got it preloaded again. It ended up changing by about 90 degrees on the bolt from our previous mark, which is to be expected. You can't see the old mark anymore, unfortunately, but that's to be expected because to maintain this checks out at, right now it's measuring out at about 17, 16, maybe 18. It's a little hard to read, but that's well within BMW spec and just a hair outside of or on the edge of metric mechanics spec, depending on how you read it. So more than happy with that. But it changed by 90 degrees because we just moved where the two bearings are. So we expect to have that distance change on the bolt as well. So, you know, expect to see that. But so we got this set, and now we're gonna put the carrier back in, and right now we're gonna do it with the shims from the previous attempt. We know that these are going to be wrong. The carrier is going to be too far to the driver's side. Backlash is probably going to be out of spec, but the question is by how much? So we're going to put it in with the old shims that we used during the first assembly and getting the carrier right there, and see. So same rule as before, just slap the carrier in and bolt it all down. You guys don't need to see that again, but the point here is the process for adjustment. Okay, so after playing with pinion depth, we ended up bringing the pinion forward towards the driver by about, what, 8/100ths? Or sorry, yeah, 8/100ths of a millimeter. We brought it from 3.5 to 3.42 or so, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
Yes.
so 3.42. So we brought it 8/100ths of a millimeter forward, and then we brought the carrier over about 1/10 of a millimeter, roughly. We brought it over about 0.8, incidentally. So about a 1-to-1, and we've ended up with this absolutely phenomenal contact pattern, nicely centered, nice and big, on the driven side, and on the coast side. Yeah, it's a little bit more out, but it's not sharp. It's large, it's fat. This is still a really good contact pattern, and we're sitting at about 2.9 thou of backlash, which is just below metric mechanics spec of 3 to 3.5. But BMW spec of 2.4 to 5.5 puts us well within that, and with an engagement pattern like this is probably about the best we can get this diff. I expect this diff to be dead silent with this setup. So all that's left is seals. So we'll cut to putting in seals. So you thought the output shaft caps were hard to put on before. Wait until they have this this O-ring on them, then they'll really suck to put on. But these O-rings just slide on. Yes, I can English, I promise. They actually look. These are not the right O-rings. All right, so we did just discover that our O-rings were the wrong size, but I mean, you just slip the O-ring on and then you slap this bad boy on. But this seal goes down on here. And this is gonna be as simple as find a nice big socket, you know, conveniently the socket that you have that's the perfect size, or find a cup that's the right size. Let's see if I can find something that's a little closer. Perfect. All right. So this plus, and you just want to go until it's nice and flush, just like this. By the way that you know for sure that you ordered the OEM supplier of a part is this right here. That area where something has been ground off, that's where the BMW logo would have been. So that's how you know that Corteco is the OEM supplier for this seal. So the genuine BMW one is made on the same assembly line by the same people on the same day with the same equipment as this one. This one just costs, you know, a third or half the cost and doesn't go through quite as much QC. But like, these are the kind of things you're looking for. If you see this, you know you got the right part. All right, and then it's same on the other side. Next step is gonna be the 2 new circlips. So during this assembly process so far, we have just been able to take the output shaft steel, or sorry, the output shaft itself, and just slide it in and out. But there's actually a little circlip here that goes in this groove, and it locks into this groove on the output shaft. And this is what takes the little, you know, jerk from a pry bar to pop these out. So all you have to do is slot this little guy in. And I forgot the best way to do this because I haven't actually put one of these in a while. But I mean, it's just a circlip, so you just, you know, force it down in there. Like, that's definitely the way to do it. There we go, installed. So you can see it's a little undersized, and when you put the output shaft in, now it has something to hold it in place, but it's not designed to bear a ton of load. It's just to kind of keep the output shaft retained. It's not supposed to be pulled on a lot or pushed on. You know, that's, by the way, why it's so easy to swap input and output output flanges, is because all you have to do is pop that little clip out or pop the so there's the clip engaged, and now this will take just a little love tap, and then it comes right out. But yeah, circlips in. Next is the input shaft seal. Okay, so now finally the mark on here matters. So now that we know that the preload on this is correct, all we have to do is we need to take the flange off, because we need to put the new dust shield and the new seal in. And so we're going to take it off and then tighten it back and return it to that position. And we can do that because we already know it's set. Technically, if you are just going to replace a flange, if you're swapping, if this is an E36, well, this is an E36 diff, but if you're going to swap from a 4-bolt to a 6-bolt or the other way around, technically you could go to the same position on the nut, but in the real world you kind of can't, because the flanges might have a slightly different height. You need to pull the carrier out, clean the bearings of any of their oil with like brake clean, and you need to reset your pinion preload because it's gonna change. But because that's all set and we're not actually changing that, we're just putting in the seal, in this case we can just break it loose. So same procedure as we've been doing, you know, put a lock on this and take that nut off. And I will remind you that there is no torque spec for that nut. There is no torque spec. If you see one, it's wrong, because the torque of that nut is solely there to get the preload of the pinion correct. That's all it's doing. You don't turn that to a torque spec because it's probably going to fuck up the preload. It may not, you might get lucky, but it's probably gonna mess it up. But anyways, so that's off. Now I can pull the input flange off, and I can pop on the new seal. It's gonna go right in here. And let me get oh, that's perfect. So I'm just gonna grab this and then give her a little bit of this. And I'm just going until it's flush. So right about there, And then this guy needs the new, and this is not a required part, but it's definitely nice to have. Oh, fun. The oil has completely bleached that, if any text. But with all the work that you're gonna need to do on, you know, if you have the proper turning tool that bolts to this, or you make one, that's great. But man, a pipe wrench works so well that I'm like, buy this, you know, $6 thing, and then I don't need to make a specialty tool. But this guy is just a, man, where did you get this press kit? I need one. It's got a lot of things that are just the right size. That's nice, new and pretty yellow zinc chromate. And now slap that guy on and slap this guy on, and yeah, right there. And we're gonna recheck the backlash there just to make sure that that's happy. And if this seal gets, or if this dust cover gets deformed at all, just find its low spot. Just squeeze it up a little bit. It's easy to bend it up a little bit accidentally. But it's just there as a dust shield so that so the actual shaft seal isn't as exposed and is more protected. So it doesn't have to be perfect, just as long as it doesn't scrape anything. But yeah, that's the input shaft seal. All right, so all the shaft seals are in, pending O-rings when we get ones that actually fit. But this little guy is the lock that holds, let me pop it back out. This is the lock that actually holds this nut and prevents it from spinning off. So you just line it up here, and you take your handy dandy socket that you've been using this whole time, and just a couple of good love taps. If you look closely, you can see that it's flared out in the two little reliefs there, which is exactly what we want. This is now, they're a pain in the butt to get out. I just learned that a better way to get it out than I probably showed at the start of this video is you put a screw into it and you just turn the screw and it'll come right out. But yeah, that's done. Pinion is set and done. The last part is the rear cover seal and a new O-ring for the, you have the rear cover. There's going to be a new O-ring for this, and the Ireland engineering kit also happens to come with a new plate. So we'll do that. And then there's a big gasket here, and then your drain and fill plug, and then it's done. That's it. All right, so last part, we've got the new O-ring in here and the new cover plate, and we've got the new hardware, except for the longer bolts. Error on my part, but E34 things. On E34 is all the bolts the same length. By the way, everything here is the same E34 to E36 to E32. Any medium case 188 that's of this era, it's all the same. Yeah, the rear cover is different, but the procedure's identical. But so then we just hung the new gasket paper on that. By the way, the kit will come, at least from Ireland Engineering, it comes with two different paper gaskets. One of them is for the E34, the other is for the E36, because the back of the case has a slightly different shape, but like, it's the same thing. But this makes putting the gasket on and getting it in the right spot really simple, because I just hang it on the bolts and then go around and start each one of the bolts. But this diff is She's ready to send.